people truly knew how powerful their mind was, they wouldn't say, think, or feel something they didn't want to be true. If you knew how truly powerful your mind was, you wouldn't say, think, or feel something you didn't want to be true. And that's not to say you have one negative thought and it ruins your life, any more than eating that donut every once in a while does. But it's the consistency of doing that.
How come we don't know that? How come that's something that we gloss over so easily? Is it because we can't see our gray matter? Is it because we don't see the immediate correlation? You know, but we talk about this so often, but why is that such a hard thing for people to understand?
That when you're first born, we're a blank slate, right? There's nothing there until we have an experience, and we try to avoid the pain, and so we come up with these global general beliefs about things that protect us. And so what I would say for this is that's why I think practices of mindfulness they're so important, because it brings us in the moment. Know that our thoughts aren't who we are necessarily, but you've heard me say this when people come to me all the time at any event. I just gave a talk recently, and people say things like, Jim, I have a horrible memory, or I'm getting too old, or I'm not smart enough. And I always tell people, if you fight for your limitations, you get to keep them, right? And you have to be careful and mindful of these thoughts. And that's why I think journaling is an important tool. Meditation is an important tool, because it sensitizes you to this inner talk, this critic, if you will, which incidentally, on a tangent, that inner talk is why we read so slow. And I know I'm going very tangential, but one of the things I teach companies, individuals, is to read 2 or 3 times faster. Imagine if you could go online and pick up, 30 books and read them in 30 or 60 days, what kind of advantage you would have, right? If a lot of your authors, you have a lot of your guests are authors and they have decades of experience, and if they could put it into a book and you could sit down and read that book in a few days, then you could download decades into days. And that's the biggest advantage that there is, because it saves you time and mistakes and errors, and it gives you also this level of expertise, where experts are some of the most valued people in our society in terms of knowledge. There's not even there's a gap in wealth, but it's also a gap in those who know and those who don't know. And I feel like learning, and I'm not a great I don't play golf very well, so I don't play it very well. So it's this confidence loop in psychology, where if I played golf better, I'd probably play it more and I get better at it. And same thing with any kind of skill. But things with when it comes to reading, most people say they're not a really great reader. And it's not their fault, because you're not born, going back to that blank slate, with the ability to read. You were taught in school. But when's the last time you took a class called reading? I mean, Brian, how old were you last time you took, not a college lit class, but a class called reading? And that's the thing, most of us are still reading like we're 6 or 7 years old. And the difficulty and the demand has increased exponentially, but our skills haven't updated to that level. So that growing gap creates that stress.
Yeah, I struggle with reading. And is it because you think there's an inner voice going along with
so that inner voice is called subvocalization, meaning that if you have to say, you ever notice when you're reading something, you hear that inner voice inside your head reading along with you? Hopefully it's your own voice. It's not like somebody else's voice in there. The reason why it's an obstacle to your reading is because if you have to say the words inside your mind in order to understand them, then you can only read as fast as you could speak. That's why most people are slow readers, because they're saying the words, so their reading speed is limited to their talking speed, but not their thinking speed. That's why you can listen to a book on tape or a podcast at a higher speed, because you can understand that at that pace, but you can't speak at that pace.
Gotcha.
And here's the thing, when you're reading and you see all these words, 95% of those words are words you've seen many times, thousands of times, countless times. So you don't have to pronounce a word or a series of words like New York City in order to understand what New York City is. And the best readers, the trained readers, they mitigate and reduce that subvocalization, read by sight. And that's a huge advantage, but we weren't taught that because that subvocalization's been there ever since we were a child. When they pass around that book, and teachers, you'd have to read it out loud.
Out loud, yeah.
You know, and then later on, teachers said, read silently to yourself, read quietly to yourself, and we internalize that voice. But going back, that voice also is that critic or that doubter, the one that's a squelcher, that we don't want to make mistakes. And we know in terms of accelerated learning, the fastest learners are children. How fast can a child learn a musical instrument? How fast can they learn another language, right? They have this sense of wonder, and part of it is their neuroplasticity, but science is showing even now that no matter what your age, that you could grow older, but you could create new brain cells to the day you die. You could create new connections using the power of novelty and nutrition, and it's very amazing. But I think also children, they play, they're very playful. They're not afraid of making mistakes, right? A child learning how to walk could fall 4, 5, 6 times, or 4, 5, 600 times, but they never after 12 times say, okay, this is I'm quitting, I'm not gonna do this because I don't wanna look bad. But adults, we do that.
Yeah.
If we're honest, most adults, they'll try something once or twice, and then they have that fear of looking bad. And I feel like that's what keeps us from living the person we're supposed to be, is that inner critic of fear of looking bad to others. And you and I have talked about this, you could go broke buying into the opinions and expectations of those around us. And for those people who are trying to find their passion and their purpose, and I know a lot of your viewers ask about that, I feel like sometimes we know it, but it's buried underneath all that other stuff. And we're always scared about what other people are gonna think about it. But going back to begin with the end in mind, when we're in that coffin, there's not a lot of room in there for possessions. And I'm all for people, you can have all the toys and everything, but there's also not a lot of room in there for regret. And so we want to live each day coming from that place. I think a through line of people that have the kind of impact that they want to have is they're not a thermometer, but they identify more with that thermostat that you and I have talked about. That a thermometer just reacts to the environment, and we react to the weather and everything else, and politics and how people treat us. But ultimately, a thermostat sets a standard, it sets a goal, it sets a vision, and then the environment, it rises to be able to meet that. And I was doing this training. I do a lot with actors, as you mentioned, to speed read scripts, remember their lines.
It'd be difficult for actors to do that.
It is, because if you ever look at the script, remembering things verbatim, memory obviously is something that's very useful, especially if people, even if you've toasted a wedding, or you need to give any kind of public speech, or you need to make videos, or be able to have a one-on-one meeting with a client or do a sales call, and it helps to have information at your mental fingertips. It's just we haven't been taught how to be able to memorize those kind of things, and that's what every single episode that you've listened to of our podcast is just like, this is how you do it, because it's taking a noun like memory and turning it into a verb. And just like we talked about focus, you don't have focus, you do focus. You don't have creativity and hope, you don't wake up hoping that you could have creativity so you can make videos and write and paint, but there's a process for creativity. And so what if we could take that magic and deconstruct it into methods for people? So this is how you can do these certain things, and then it becomes a verb, and then what it gives you your sovereignty back, it gives you your personal power back, because the locus, we were talking about location before, of control is on the inside. And because I imagine with a lot of your guests that talk about the science of happiness, that they know that ultimately it's within them and not on circumstance, because you could always find a counterexample for somebody who didn't have the money, they didn't have the education, they didn't have the connections, and they still succeeded at huge levels. And if you look at those outliers and maybe study the outliers instead of just marginalizing them and not keeping them part of that.
We all have two people. And I'm not saying you're crazy. We have the easy voice, which is that 20% telling yourself that I'm easy at 90% of my full potential, maybe 100% at that 20%. That's that voice that we all love. That's that very comfortable voice, that's that mommy. holding you, saying it's going to be okay. Doesn't care how